Hello everyone. This is the 11th part of the story, Abe the Wizard. Chapter 50, Transformation Necklace. The runes were different on both rune signs. Although Abel was unable to identify which runes it was, he decided to bring it back to the castle first and test it out on a sword. Abel picked up the orc technique sign from the orc again. The structure of this technique sign looked similar to the one he had before. There was an engraving of a goddess of orcs on the top and a star at the bottom. It seemed like this rune sign was also for one-time use only before its power was completely drained. Of course, Abel wouldn't let this opportunity slide. He injected his power of the will into the orc's rune sign. He gained experience from last time, and he knew how he could search for the special technique within it. Abel's sight became blurred. He felt like he had become a middle wargen on a mount wolf holding a long spear. From the message he was delivered, he knew that this rune sign had documented the long spear techniques of the wolf family, an orc royal family. Their long spear techniques were different from the one of the knights. There was a brief spell attached to every move they had. Maybe it was because these were the techniques from a royal family. Anyways, the spell was written in very simplified terms. It did not include any words of admiration towards the orc gods. The middle-aged wargen struck out his long spear according to the motion of his mount wolf. After a bit of consideration, Abel executed the 11th long spear technique. It corresponded perfectly with the mount wolf. Every time the wargen said the curse, the long spear would make a sharp piercing noise through the air. From the information Abel gained through the orc's technique sign, he understood that the power unleashed by these long spear techniques did not depend on combat chi. Since everyone has their combat chi limit, a person's physical power still mattered the most. It was only at the time of necessity where they will ignite their combat chi. Moreover, this orc royal long sword technique didn't have a time limit. You could use it as long as you still had energy in your body. Although Abel had learned both the Bennett and Harry Heritage Knight techniques, they all required combat chi to be executed. This was the first time Abel had seen a non-combat chi technique. By only saying a spell with a corresponding motion, it could continuously achieve a strike with twice the power. It seemed like Abel was bound with the Wirgens by fate. He had gained 2 technique signs from the orcs, and both times it was a technique from the Wirgens. Abel watched as the orc technique sign vanished into thin air. Although Abel could not grasp the value of this technique, he understood how important they were to the royals in the Orc Empire. Just like all royal families, their techniques were exclusive and should not let other people get a hold of it. There was also a shape-shifting necklace, but Abel did not have time to examine it. There was still another orc he needed to take care of. He put the necklace around his neck and shoved the rest of his things in his pocket. Abel was intrigued by the black armor. Once the buckles were taken off, it could be folded into a rectangle that was easy to be carried around. Such craftsmanship was not something you'd expect from the Orc Empire. Abel raised his big sword as he stared at the wargen corpse on the ground. Since he arrived in this world, he had killed many Wirgens and seen many dead bodies. However, it was still a bit hard for him to chop off the head of another individual. Although Abel's perspective had changed a lot during the last 2 years, he was still very much attached to the social values of his past life. In this world, chopping the head off your enemy was a sign of power. However, in his old world, it was considered disrespectful. Well, I'm strong enough to carry some extra weight anyways, Abel thought to himself, and eventually decided to pick up the dead wargen on the ground. With its body in his one hand and the black armor in the other, he began to climb his way up to the top of the hill. When Abel reached the top of the hill, he still chose the leeward region. Therefore, he could keep his eyes on the condition of the giant bird from afar. At that time, the sky sparrow was no longer oozing out blood, and its wound has been treated. Due to excessive flying and bleeding, it had already fallen asleep. The wargen was setting up his tent as he was completely unaware of Abel's presence. As Abel placed the dead body of Fowler and the black armor down carefully, He took out his Harry's bow and shot directly at the Wargen's heart. It did a turn, but not fast enough for it to escape its misfortune. However, the arrow did not hit the Wargen directly in the heart. It only created a hole through his body. The arrows seemed to hit the lungs of the Wargen with its spines being shot directly through. The fallen Wargen did not die. Instead, he grasped to reach his hand into his chest pocket and took out a sign. When he was about to crush the metal, Abel recognized his move. He immediately shot the Wargen once again in the brain. Its hand slowly released and the sign dropped onto the ground. After shooting the Wolf Rider, Abel looked at the bird. The action seemed to not bother the bird's rest. Abel slowly went up to the Wargen. He used his foot to kick it to ensure that it was dead. The vitality of the Wargen was beyond the imagination of Abel. It was shot through the lungs and spine, yet it was still able to take things out from its chest pocket. The medal that was dropped by the rider wolf had 3 orc characters on it. Abel recognized the words which meant Sky Sparrow, with the number 36 underneath it. There were also some rune lines that Abel could not understand. It was stretched out from the diamond and surrounded the entire back of the sign. While Abel wasn't sure how to cast the spell or how it functioned, he was a very curious boy that was eager to learn. Since there wasn't a spell, he could use his power of the will to connect to the metal directly. Normally, these orcs' technique signs required casting some complex spells that corresponded before using it. However, as Abel was experienced with these things, he could just use his power of will. It was like a walk in the park. Abel directly injected his power of the will into the sign. As soon as he got close to the sign, the diamond began to flash a beam of white light. Abel continued to swim towards the light. In a split second, the sign was surrounded by the lights. Abel's power of the will also became intertwined with the lights. Suddenly, he felt an odd sensation, as though he was having a body scan. Afterward, he felt 2 orc letters appeared from the sign. It said, "Rejected." "What do you mean, rejected?" Abel immediately understood that this sign was extremely important to the orcs. To the point where the last thing that was in that Wargen's mind before it died, was to destroy it. The experiment Abel had just did suggested that he could activate this sign with his power of the will. However, the sign had a safety mechanism. When Abel had that special sensation that he was being scanned, it seemed like the sign could detect that Abel was not an orc, so the metal refused to activate. Was there no other way? At that moment, Abel felt like his heart was being scratched by a cat. What a pity. If the metal could not be activated, Abel might have to give up on the spot. However, since he was able to activate it, he was just 1 step away from passing the detection. Abel then thought to himself, if I was an orc, maybe I could pass the detection. Suddenly, he was reminded of the necklace on his chest. If Fowler could transform himself into a human, could the opposite be possible? Abel decided to give it a go. As he took the necklace out from his chest and tried to remember the spell, he thought deeply for a second. He was certain the spell was complete. Abel examined the surroundings around him to ensure that it was safe. The 2 Wargens chose this spot for a reason. The hills were not high and there were a lot of trees. Especially those tall trees which could block out the top of the mountain. It was the perfect hiding place for a camp. Abel held the transformation necklace outside his sleeve. He pressed on top of it with his fingers and began to utter out the orc's spell. Following Abel's spell, a powerful force appeared again in the sky, as if the spell was connected to the transcendent life. A higher life that Abel could not comprehend. Abel immediately felt a little bit of pressure which made him gain a fear from the bottom of his heart. A flash of green light on the necklace grew stronger and soon wrapped around Abel's body. He promptly felt that the necklace gave him 3 choices: orcs, humans, and elves. Abel imagined in his heart the look of the Wargen Fowler that he had killed. Within the blink of an eye, he felt a throbbing muscle tear that made him gasp. His bones began to ring as he grew taller and taller. Then, gray-brown hair grew throughout his body. His face began to deform. His teeth grew wildly. With the disappearance of the green light, Abel had fully transformed into a wargen. He could even feel that his organs were different from before. It was magical, Abel couldn't help but exclaim in his heart. After using the necklace, Abel had also learned a bit of information about the necklace. Chapter 51, White Cloud the Sky Sparrow. The transformation necklace was a treasure from the Wolf royal family. Back in the old days, it was a magical item made to facilitate the family's members to travel through the Holy Continent. It was said that the orc god had to sacrifice a large amount to invite great druid, from the elves to complete the necklace together. Therefore it could only be used by the most important members of the wolf family's younger generation. The recovering spell of the transformation necklace was also inherited only by the wolf family. Suddenly, Abel had realized that he didn't know the spell of how to recover back into a human. He only knew the spell of how to transform into a wargen. Luckily, these magic items would often contain information about its using instructions within it. Therefore Abel could find the recovering spell by injecting his power of the will. He told himself, he must be sure to pay closer attention to these spell casts next time. If he really couldn't transform back into a human, the only option he would have left was to go and live in the Orc Empire. Once again, Abel picked up the sign with the symbols saying Sky Sparrow and connected to it with his power of the will. He immediately felt the detective wave that occurred from the last test. He felt like he was having a body scan again. When the sign scanned Abel's power of the will, it passed and questioned Abel whether he was the owner. Abel looked directly at the dead wargen on the floor. He knew that it was the owner of the sign. If it was still alive, no one other than him should be able to use it. Obey, I am the owner. Abel answered with his power of the will. Then there was a flash of white light. Abel immediately felt a sense of connection between the sign and himself. It felt much like the connection between him and the Mount Wolf Black Wind that he adopted. A bundle of messages was coming to him through his power of the will. The sign was called the Sky Sparrow Control Number 36, and it was under the command of the Orc military of the Heavy Flying Beast Transportation Brigade. Each sign was able to control one unique Sky Sparrow, and only the owner of the sign was able to command the bird. According to the control information from the sign, these Sky Sparrows were very easy to feed and it ate mostly everything edible as its digestive ability was extremely strong. In normal circumstances, it was able to find itself food. The bird also had no enemies in the skies due to its enormous size, and back in the Orc Kingdom, these birds were generally placed in the forest area. Whenever there was a transportation mission, they were directly recalled through this control sign. Abel then carefully inspected the number 36 bird control signs and found diamonds on it. There was a very faint wave of soul. When Abel had connected with the wave of the soul with the power of the will, suddenly, the Sky Sparrow was awakened. When the Sky Sparrow was awakened, it ignored its original owner who was lying dead on the ground. Instead, it was looking directly at Abel nervously along with a sense of curiosity. Abel then used his power of the will again to connect with the soul of the Sky Sparrow. He felt that it was curiosity yet nervousness. Abel couldn't help but want to pat the Sky Sparrow on its head, but it was too big and tall. Although Abel wasn't able to reach the bird's head, the bird seemed to be able to read Abel's mind. It slowly lowered its head towards Abel and closed its eyes, waiting for Abel to pat him. Abel gently patted the head of the bird, and at that moment, the bird's heart immediately felt a sense of joy. The bird seemed to have a lot of things that it wanted to share with Abel. Abel then continued to use the control sign number 36 to communicate with it. The bird expressed how painful its wound was, how hungry he was, as well as its anger of being attacked. Although it wasn't able to express the words clearly, through the power of the will, Abel was able to understand most of the things it was saying. All Sky Sparrows had a master who was able to control them through a special control sign. However, these birds were still animals, and they had their ways of thinking, emotions, and needed their owners to care for them. Normally, Wargen could not understand or able to directly communicate with these birds. Only a man like Abel was able to mentally connect to its soul through the control sign. By being able to communicate with each other, the birds seemed to have developed a sense of good impression towards Abel. "You are so gigantic and pale, when you're in the sky, you're like a white cloud. From now on I am going to call you White Cloud," said Abel. When the bird heard the name, it seemed to like it very much. A sense of joy and approval was passed to Abel through the control sign. Looking at White Cloud, Abel couldn't imagine the feeling of riding a bird like this in the skies. In his past life, he had flown in an airplane and glided. But flying on a large bird was something that he had never thought of before. "It looks like we'll be staying here for 2 more days. When you've recovered, we'll be on our way home." White Cloud nodded back to Abel. It seemed to be very happy to share his feelings with his owner. It had never been more excited in its life. "Wait for me. I'll go down the mountain and get the horses." The control sign revealed that the bird seemed to be not willing to separate from its owner. When Abel noticed its reaction, he couldn't control himself but smiled to appease the bird for a little longer. He only went down the mountain when the bird was quietly resting. When Abel saw his 2 warhorses as he was arriving at the foot of the mountain, the warhorses were immediately alerted and transitioned into a guarding position. Abel felt a little surprised, then he realized that he was in a Wirgin's body. Luckily, he was only seen by his warhorses, not humans. Abel then quickly took out his necklace and cast the recovering spell. After a flash of green light, he transformed back into his human form. The 2 horses still slowly approached Abel, though wondering how the strange man had just suddenly transformed into their master. When Abel traveled back to the top of the mountain with the 2 horses, he saw the big head of White Cloud rolling around. When White Cloud saw Abel's return, it was moving its mouth rapidly as it was extremely exciting and was in joy. White Cloud didn't seem to care what Abel had looked like as it felt Abel's presence through his soul. The horses seemed to have been frightened by the size of the bird. However, they had been trained so well that they had only stopped and did not run away, only kicking their front hooves a little impatiently. Abel then patted the 2 horses, and took out some of the fine horse food and fed some to both the horses. When the horses felt Abel's presence, they were calmed again. They were here to stay here for 2 days. Luckily, the Wirgins had already set up their tents earlier. There were 2 tents. One was very ordinary, which probably belonged to the Wirgin with leather armor. The smell inside was horrible. However, the other tent was very luxurious. Its interior was very clean, though not too big. It was enough for 3 people to sleep side by side. Abel was not too clear what material was used, but it was for sure very expensive. While Abel was lying in the tent, he was thinking for an excuse on why he had gone for 2 days. No one could find out about White Cloud. Abel decided to leave his bird in the forest behind the hairy castle. He could summon it any time anyways. Abel had gotten way too used to being in the blacksmith guild every day. Since he did not bring his rune brush or rune ink on this journey, he was bored out of his mind. Maybe it was time for Abel to be promoted to a beginner knight. He had already been a level 5 novice knight for quite a while. Abel pondered as he stares at the 6 bottles of the master's chi condensing option in the Horadric Cube. When he recalled what the Knight of Bennett and the Knight of Marshall said, to be promoted, it required to fill the chi in the meridian completely. The more chi you had, the higher the chance you would be promoted. The best way to maximize your chances was to prepare a bottle of greater chi condensing potions, conditional equipped with a bottle of greatest chi condensing potion, and drink them together. Being promoted to an official knight was not easy. That's why so many knights were stuck at the novice rank. It was said that the younger the novice knight, the more likely he would be promoted. With the older the novice knights, they were the hardest to get promoted. As Abel touched his beardless chin. Was 13 young enough? Since all the chi condensing potion do was to fill up the chi in the meridian. Normally novice knights only need 1 greater and 1 greatest one. He got 6 Master's ones, so it should be more than enough. Abel thought about all of these conditions. He realized he had met, or even exceeded all of them. He then took the level 6 bottle of the Master's Chi condensing potion out from the Horadric Cube. After thinking for a while, Abel took out the control sign and sent a do not disturb to White Cloud. If anything appears, he could just retract the message. Finally, Abel was prepared to level up. With White Cloud being such huge and terrifying creatures, even the largest of beasts would not dare to approach them. Furthermore, it was also a long way from the nearest road. Abel thought he should not be so unlucky that other humans would be here to disturb his leveling up. Chapter 52, Promoting to be an Official Knight. Abel took a deep breath and thought about the 2 nights' experiences again. Since he wanted his body to gain more and more chi, he decided to drink all of the chi condensing potions. Abel picked up a Master's Chi condensing potion shining in dark gold and drank it without any hesitation. He poured more and more bottles of the Chi condensing potion and emptied it all into his mouth. Altogether, he had drunk around 6 bottles of the potion. When he was finished drinking, he did a large burp. Only someone like Abel could be able to drink something as powerful as these and still be able to do burps. At this time, the condensing potion in Abel's stomach began to resist the huge amount of chi rushing through his meridian. Abel had no choice but began to use the knight's breathing techniques to continuously compress the chi in his meridian. But how was he supposed to keep up his compression speed with the large amount of chi rushing through his meridian? At that moment, Abel felt as if he had transformed into a pressure cooker as his stomach continued to bloat. If it weren't for the strong physical restraint from Abel, his stomach would have exploded right away. At this time, the 5 branches of the meridian in his body began to shrink due to the strong pressure. As the meridian was being continuously compressed with higher and higher density. Then, a large amount of air that was continuously being poured into the meridian, made the empty parts of the meridian after compression filled up again. Once again, the pressure began to constrain Abel's body. Abel was now like a balloon, which would burst with the slightest poke of an external force. Feeling in danger, he had been playing with the knight's breathing techniques, and he had no other way but to rely on the knight's breathing technique now. However, the effects of the knight's breathing were already utterly inadequate. As the strong pressure on the internal abdomen was starting to hurt Abel's internal organs with blood beginning to flow out from the corners of Abel's mouth. The bones on Abel's entire body began trembling and were making squeaking and shaking noises. When Abel knew that there was nothing more he could have done, he decided to remain here and wait. No. Alongside with a roar from Abel, his mighty power of the will began to rush out of. Through his power of the will, he imagined his meridian as a rough piece of steel and his power of the will as a hammer. He began to command the hammer with his consciousness and powerfully struck a meridian out of the 5 he had. The chi within had compressed more than half of its initial size, but with the speed of light, his meridian began to fill up with chi again as soon as the hammer was lifted. Abel did not care much about his meridians. Instead, he turned to his 2nd meridian and continued to strike it without hesitation. By the time he finished striking his 5th meridian, the 1st meridian was filled with chi once again by the 6 Master's potion. As Abel continued to strike, this process of compressing and refilling the chi in his meridian created a strange sense of imbalance in his body. At that moment Abel couldn't even felt his own body, all of his perceptions were fading away. This was because all his power of the will was focused on his meridian. This meridian was just a model of steels in his eyes. Also, he was not directly striking his meridian. He only struck the area where the chi was located, hoping to force it to the center where his 5 meridians were connected. If there was anyone near Abel right now, they would have realized that he had already entered into a state of realization once again. In this state, people would generally rely on the most direct instinct of their bodies. They had no concerns about the consequences, and would not hesitate around anything. It was a fascinating ability passed down by the history of humanity. After each stroke, the compressed part would rebound some strange energy back to Abel's body. This energy was known as increasing energy. When a novice knight became an official knight, their bodies would go through a lot of developments, largely caused by this increasing energy. Not only could this increasing energy develop Abel's body, but it could also increase his power of the will. When Abel continued to strike, he was improving himself in all aspects, which he did not even realize as he was in the midst of this state realization. As the increasing energy continued to rebound with every strike, Abel's power of the will hammer was also becoming stronger, as it was being compressed. No one knew how much chi can be generated through 6 years of practice. However, when Abel was in his state of realization, he guesses maybe he could achieve it in 24 hours if he continued to revive the increasing energy rebound from each strike. So, it shouldn't be long. This was the longest that Abel had ever been in an insight before. Now, his power of the will was becoming a golden hammer, and the chi inside the meridian was longer being recharged. The effects of the 6 potions were finally over. His meridian had now become a crystal stone that was as big as his fist. As his body was being developed with the energy, his skin was shining with a light gold color. If anyone had seen Abel at that time, they would have seen through his bone marrows, which was pure as jade and as hard as a stone. Abel then opened his eyes and took in a breath of air. He thought that he wasn't going to, but luckily he made it through the process, and it felt good to be alive. After Abel had woken up, the first thing he wanted to do was to find his father Bennett and Uncle Marshall, to ask them what "the more chi the better" meant. He just drank all 6 bottles of Master's chi condensing potion without any problem. Therefore, according to the logic of the 2 knights, he should also be okay if he drank 60 bottles. Standing up, Abel found a thick layer of black shell on his skin. It was the impurities generated from the increasing of rank through the energy in his body. As there was no one nearby, he stepped out of the tent and stripped off all his clothes. When Abel continued to stretch his body in all kinds of positions, the black shell continued to fall from his body. When they were all shaken off, Abel's clear white skins were exposed. His training in becoming a knight and forging over the past 2 years had darkened his skin. However, his skins right now were the palest it had ever been. It was like a baby's skin, and when he pressed his hand onto it, it was soft yet firm. Furthermore, when you looked at his skin carefully, it was almost looked like it was flashing in light gold color from time to time. To see how fast he could go, Abel tried to push and tread. He was so fast that he had already flown straight into a tree that was being held by a man. Bang! As Abel had hit the tree, and the tree was torn from where he had hit it. The trees within 10 meters plus trees fell to the ground. White Cloud was immediately awakened from the sound. When it saw its owner, it stood up happily. The wound on its body seemed to no longer prevent it from moving. As its head gently approached Abel and wanted him to comfort it with his hands, Abel was extremely amused by the way it looked. It was very funny for such a huge creature to make such an expression. At this time, White Cloud saw the tree on the ground, could not help but brighten eyes. It looked at Abel. Abel couldn't feel the meaning of White Cloud from the control sign. Was it asking if the tree was for it to eat? Abel nodded, crying and laughing, and watched White Cloud happily eat the branches of the whole gigantic tree into his stomach. Not long after, what was a big tree had turned into only the tree trunk. Abel had also realized that his power of the will was many times stronger. It could communicate with White Cloud directly. Although he did not know the specific value of this power, he was certain that it would be no problem to draw 3 runes at the same time. Afterward, Abel continued to carefully move around, trying to get a hold of the drastic changes in his body. The first thing it noticed was that the Harry's bow had become a lot easier to pull. It almost required no effort at all. Secondly, his ice magic sword had also become a lot lighter. Holding it felt like a toothpick. He decided, the first mission he had when he got back to the castle was to make a heavier one. A knight should have weapons that suited his power. Abel could no longer use the Tai Chi from his previous to help him grasp the force of his own body. The perspective of power was completely different in this world. If his force was not explosive and vicious, it could hold back a lot of his attacking power as a knight. He tried to use Tai Chi once when he was a novice knight, but it has messed up his form and use of power. It took a long while until he could correct it. This marks the end of part 11 of the story, Abe the Wizard. Thank you for listening. Please like the video and hit the subscribe button to listen more. Hit the bell icon to get notified of all the new content uploaded to the channel ASAP.